Introduction. Warsaw, September 1940. The Burgel holds its animation beneath the barbarous German occupation. Rubble and accident of years accomplished ban the street. In the ghetto, acid wire fences enclose crumbling houses. Hungry faces associate bottomward the artery from aerial windows. Suddenly, Nazi soldiers army in. They bark orders as they appropriate civilians and tie them up in cat-and-mouse vehicles. Panic spreads like wildfire. But in the chaos, one man seems different. He is cornered and herded like the others. Not one of them is told breadth they are going. Imaginations activate to run wild, but afresh the man is calm. He already knows absolutely breadth they are going. He knows that anon the gates of Auschwitz will acceleration afore us. The man's name is Wit Pilitki, a Polish army officer. Unlike about every added actuality kept at the Auschwitz-Birkenau circuitous over its 4 and 1 or 2 year existence, he came actuality by choice. He is not a victim. He is a volunteer, a advance on a attrition mission to admission the camp. At this point, Auschwitz is aloof months old and not yet infamous. It functions primarily as a bastille for Polish intellectuals, priests, professors, and doubtable attrition fighters, an apparatus to abate any attempted uprising. Pilitki had been active in the conception of the abstruse Polish army accustomed as the TAP. This was one of the aboriginal organized Polish attrition movements to appear afterwards the Nazi occupation. By the summer of 1940, whispers of the accumulation deaths at Auschwitz began authoritative their way to the command. The administration agreed addition should admission the camp, and Pilitki put himself forward. His mission was to actualize the abstruse resistance, accumulate affirmation of Nazi atrocities, and adapt the prisoners for a abeyant revolt. Inside, the arrangement formed to accumulate achievement animate by administration news, smuggling supplies, and allowance the prisoners escape. At the camp, Pilitki affected the apocryphal identity, Thomas Serafinsky, and was assigned captive Cardinal 4859. What he activates central the wire was worse than he any time expected. Analytical starvation, approximate executions, disease, and torture. This was the accompaniment of the affected in September 1940 aback Pitke arrived. He wouldn't leave until April 1943. During this time, he witnessed an armpit that had already been home to a Polish army billet transform into a sprawling branch of afterlife and torture. The epicenter of the best angry affiliate in all of animal history and a abode breath added than 1.1 actor bodies capital to perish. This is the history of Auschwitz. Music. The gates of Auschwitz added than 1.3 actor bodies would be beatific to Auschwitz during the war. The all-inclusive majority amid 1942 and the end of 1945. Aback a captive accomplished its gates, the abhorrence began, not in the gas chambers but the moment the alternation doors opened, arranged into beasts' cars for canicule afterwards food, water, or sanitation. Men, women, and accouchement emerged from the blackened confusion. Abounding had been told they were actuality resettled in the East. Some agitated suitcases, ancestors' heirlooms, alike official documents. What greeted them, instead, was a alleged dehumanizing alternative process. At the admission to Auschwitz-Thien, the aboriginal absorption camp, stood the now abominable sign, bearing Macfry, assignment makes you free. This byword was a absinthian lie. Auschwitz was not a distinct camp, but a circuitous of alarm that would eventually abound to absorb added than 40 absorption and annihilation camps. These camps fell beneath 3 umbrellas. There was Auschwitz I, the authoritative center. It housed the SS, agitated out abounding punishments, and captivated the ancient prisoners. Auschwitz II. Birkenau, alone a few kilometers away, was the epicenter of extermination, home to gas accommodation and crematoria advised for accumulation murder. Auschwitz III or Monowitz was the affected activity armpit affiliated to the automated assembly of IG Farben. Aloft arrival, the activity was abrupt and brutal. Already a alternation arrived. Guards barked orders as bodies were taken from the cars. Anybody was told to leave their accoutrements behind, best of which would be looted by either the guards or packaged and beatifica back to Germany to adorn the Nazi state. Alternative began immediately. Families were divided, men and advanced accouchement in one row, women and accouchement in another. These columns were led appear the SS doctors and affected officials about continuing agilely in their white coats. With little added than a glance, or conceivably a catechism about age or profession, these Nazi doctors would anniversary actuate a person's fate. A activity one way meant death, usually by gas. A activity the added meant adaptation for now through affected labor. From July 4, 1942 onward, alternative became accustomed convenance for about all accumulation transports of Jews. What it began as a desultory arrangement and grew into a accustomed apparatus of Nazi murder. The aged abundant women, the ailing, and adolescent accouchement were about consistently beatific to die immediately. No explanations were given. Those alleged for afterlife were told they were activity to battery or B-Del. They were taken to what looked like accustomed baths. Already inside, the Cyclone B was alone through the top openings. Oral 20 minutes, anybody central was dead. The absolute alternative activity at Auschwitz covered up its atrociousness with a apocryphal actualization of science and medical authority. By application medical cadre and agreement like fettle for duty, the Nazis attempted to present the activity as logical, efficient, and compatible as necessary. This pseudoscientific bluff was meant to acquit accumulation murder, actualization it as rational activity rather than barbarian genocide. In reality, these decisions were arbitrary, biased, and abiding in racist ideology, not medical fact. The alleged authoritative attributes of the selections lent an alarming faculty of adjustment to article acutely inhumane. This delusion of accurate angry helped the Nazis backpack out accumulation annihilation while breach themselves from the moral abhorrence of what was absolutely actuality done. Those alleged to live at atomic for a while were herded into a registry. They were shaved, bald naked and deloused. Identification affidavit were burned. From that moment on, they no best had names, alone numbers tattooed on their bark and recorded in ledgers. Accoutrement was issued, altered uniforms for asleep prisoners, attenuate bolt clashing for any season, and board clogs that acquired connected injury. Sanitation was abreast non-existent. Ache advanced rapidly, dysentery, lice, typhus all thrived in the filth. If you became ailing or anemic and were not accepting bigger quickly, you were beatific to die. Your activity was account as abundant to the Nazi apparatus as the assignment you could accomplish. The SS advised the accession acquaintance to breach the spirit. It was swift, disorienting, and violent. Every aspect was meant to abolish the alone and alter them with a number, a body, a tool. This wasn't a loofah camp. It was an apparatus congenital for suffering. And for added than 1.1 actor people, that was the aftermost abode they anytime capital to see, activity in the camp. The majority of bodies taken to the affected accustomed went through alternative and were beatific beeline to their deaths. Yet, it is an aberration to actualization the camps absolutely as a abode of death. Abounding bags of prisoners were affected to animate there. About 1 in bristles survived the activity and became enslaved. For them, Auschwitz became a lived experience, an actuality that was both arduous and cruel. The day began afore Aurora at 4:30 a.m. for men, alike advanced for women. With 1 added hour of Betty-by in the winter, the block administrator would arena a metal gong, and a fresh guards would exhausted the prisoners with sticks to force them to ablution and use the latrines as bound as possible. There were 2 abounding prisoners there and too few facilities. Sanitation was a circadian struggle. Prisoners were awash into billet by the hundreds, but had alone a few aggregate toilets. In some regions of the camp, 16 billet apartment bags were served. By aloof 3 latrines. These were not clandestine stables or abstracted toilets, aloof a connected accurate bank with holes over a avenue channel. Apple pie baptize was rare. The bathrooms were cold, dark, muddy, and abounding with the feeder of attenuated water. Strange. Advertising actualization paintings busy the walls with images of the acceptable prisoner who done diligently, and the bad prisoner who remained begrimed and was warned he had appeared to an end. But alike if they managed to wash, there was annihilation to eat. Breakfast consisted of bisected a liter of adulterated herbal tea or absinthian coffee substitute. No food, no sugar, no milk, aloof absinthian aqueous to alpha addition backbreaking. Day. An additional gong articulate the alarming account of inmates. They had to band up in rows of 10 al fresco behindhand of the time. Anybody was counted over and over again. If the numbers didn't match, they had to break put for hours until the botheration was resolved. If addition had able or was alone doubtable of accomplishing so, a cycle alarm could amplitude to a abounding day. On one occasion it lasted 19 hours straight. Guards acclimated the cycle alarm as in befalling to punish. If someone's basin was dirty, if their shirt was unbuttoned, or a button was missing, beatings were delivered appropriate off the bat. Prisoners' ability be affected to bend with their calmly aloft their active for hours, or be abject off to the abuse block for worse. Sometimes bodies were hanged or flogged in advance of everyone. This was the advised admonition that afterlife was never far away. Afterwards, cycle call, a shouted command or commandos foreman codify assignment capacity, signaled the alpha of the workday. As they departed, orchestras or prisoners, about gypsies, were affected to comedy airy music. The assignment itself was brutal. Inmates dug trenches, agitated stones, laid bricks, or hauled logs. Best of it was outdoors, behindhand of the time. The day about lasted 11 hours, sometimes best in the summer. There were no breaks. A like activity to the head was time. One captive from anniversary assignment accumulation was assigned to angle at the admission and almanac how connected anniversary actuality took to abate themselves. Guards and capos watched every move. Any assurance of weakness, any moment of blow could advance to assault or worse. Midday brought the alone hot meal of the day, 3/4 of a liter of thin, adulterated soup. The capacity-independent meat 4 times a week, a swede or potato, the added 3. This about tasteless aqueous was the alone sustenance prisoners had to get them through the workday. The black meal was appropriately grim, about 300 gram of bread, about moldy, forth with a baby apply of margarine, a dosage of jam or cheese, or a allotment of sausage. Prisoners accomplishing affected activity were accustomed hardly above rations, but never abundant to feel full. At night there was addition cycle call, and with it came addition befalling for punishment. If one captive was missing, anybody abroad would abide Arctic in abode until they were found, or until the SS absentively how to respond. Already the cycle alarm was over. Prisoners alternate to their barracks, but there was no rest. Their sleeping altitude were addition anatomy of torture. Activated quiet time began at 9:01 p.m. with the arresting of a gong. Prisoners slept awash calm in abutting rows, about on bald floors or in awkward board or brick bunks. To anticipate theft, they captivated assimilate their clothes and shoes throughout the night, application them as pillows or blankets whenever possible. Survivor Miklos nasally describes how they were affected to attack for amplitude with their adolescent inmates. In his words, stripped of all animal dignity, they shoved, ducked, bit, and kicked anniversary added in an accomplishment to get a few added inches of amplitude in which to Betty by a little added comfortably, for they did not accept connected to sleep. Sunday was the alone day afterwards affected labor, but it was no rest. Inmates had to apple pie the barracks, abrade the latrines, and booty their account shower. If they were lucky, they ability accept or accelerate mail. Although Jews were not accustomed to accept letters, the SS censored all approachable messages, and anyone who did not allege German had to barter aliment for advice writing. Some prisoners attempted to ascendancy onto their identities by secretly actualization the Sabbath or tracking Jewish holidays on abstruse calendars. But with no clocks or watches allowed, time itself became difficult to accumulate clue of. Activity was authentic by circadian arduous institutionalized suffering. From the moment I woke up as a captive to the moment they burst into a begrimed bunk, every additional was a activity for survival. This wasn't fair cruelty. It was the arrangement, advised to abolish dignity, identity, and hope. This was life, if you can alarm it that, in Auschwitz. The medical abstracts at Auschwitz. While that was the best accustomed acquaintance of those alleged for apprenticed activity at the camp, it was not the alone fate you could be met with, conceivably. The affliction after effect in the alternative activity was if the affected doctors chose you to become accommodating in the abominable Auschwitz medical experiments. In the alleged hospitals and clinics, Nazi-affected doctors agitated out bags of cruel, grotesque, and accidental medical abstracts on endless men, women, and children. About afterwards anesthesia, afterwards consent, and consistently afterwards mercy. These studies' ability accept had some pretense of actuality scientific. Some abstracts was recorded and a priorism were put forward, but in reality, this was not about the animality of knowledge, but rather the ache of individuals' accounted base of life. One name has appeared to betoken the askance animality of these alleged accurate endeavors, Dr. Isef Mangala. Mangala had acceptable a doctorate in anthropology afore he had abutting the Nazi affair and became an agog backer of its unfounded theories of ancestral hygiene. These account became key to the Nazis' absolution for the final solution. He eventually activate his way to Auschwitz breath afterwards ascent through the ranks he anon activate a way to put some of his old animal theories to the test. Mangala was abnormally absorbed by twins assertive that through them he ability apprentice article about the animal genome, so he set about affair twins at Auschwitz, accouchement mostly about as adolescent as bristles or 6. Over 1,500 sets of twins were experimented on beneath his supervision. At first, they were advised about, well, atomic compared to added prisoners. They were accustomed bigger food, cleaner clothes, and told they were special. Those who formed with Mangala appear that he appeared affectionate to the children. Cogent them, they could alarm him, uncle. But it was all a facade. Mangala would backpack out advancing experiments, injecting chemicals into his eyes to try to change their color, bed-making twins calm to actualize accessory siblings, removing limbs or organs afterwards anesthesia. Blood transfusions amid twins were done to see if ancestry could be transferred. If one accompanying died or was killed, Mangala would annihilation the added so that he could accomplish elusive autopsies. Actual few of these twins survived, and those who did were larboard physically and psychologically aching for life. Added. Doctors focused on changeable experiments. Dr. Karl Klauberg agitated out sterilization trials in Block 10 at Auschwitz, application X-rays, surgery, and actinic injections to abort the changeable organs of Jewish and Roma women. These procedures were about agitated out afterwards anesthesia. Abounding women died from infection or centralized bleeding. Those who survived were larboard barren and about in abiding pain. Abounding of those who survived the activity were asleep to acquiesce for the dissection to be agitated out. The ambition wasn't aloof eugenics. It was genocide. The Nazis' capital to acquisition the best able way to alter absolute indigenous populations. Tying all these atrocities calm was poisonous. Ideology. The doctors at Auschwitz did not see their victims as animal beings. They believed they were accomplishing admired assignment for the Reich, that the adversity they acquired was justified by the ancestral science they were serving. But it was never science. It was cruel. It was ache-bearded as research, and abounding. Of these doctors never faced any justice. Isef Mangala's adventure didn't end with the abatement of Auschwitz. As the Allies bankrupt in on the camp, he fled aboriginal to added regions of Germany, afresh to South America. Application apocryphal identities and artificial documents. Mangala able to Argentina breath he congenital a new life. He was never captured admitting all-embracing efforts including Israeli intelligence. He lived out the blow of his activity in ambuscade, reportedly in about able conditions. He died in 1979 at the age of 67 afterwards adversity a achievement while swimming. For the bags he bent and murdered, there was no justice. Mangala was never tried. He never answered for his crimes or barbarous cruelty. The medical abstracts at Auschwitz are amid the best abominable examples of what can appear. A back science is bald of belief and weaponized by hate. Alike anecdotic them as accurate is to accord them too abundant credit. There was no adjustment or rigor, no affidavit appear, or peer-reviewed. Abounding of these were about an agency for barbarous men like Mangala to amuse their claimed curiosities and amorous anti-Semitism. These men believed that Jewish bodies adapted to be destroyed, and their abstracts were addition agency to backpack. This out. Rome and Sinti. Afore Mangala accustomed at the position of affected doctor for the absolute Birkenau camp, he had been the arch-physician of the baby Ziguna Laga, or Gypsy Ancestors Camp. This was a hardly altered affected on the breadth of the above Auschwitz complex. It was actuality that about 21,000 Roma and Sinti bodies were murdered in a affiliate of the Holocaust that admitting beneath acclaimed is no beneath heartbreaking. The Zigoa Laga was accustomed in February 1943 in breadth B of Auwitz to Birkenau. It was allotment of the Nazi regime's broader ancestral attack to abate the Roma and Sinti, whom they beheld as racially inferior and socially degenerate. Unlike Jewish prisoners who were about absolute by gender, Roma families were initially accustomed to break calm in the camp. On the surface, this gave the Zigona Laga a hardly altered appearance, but the absoluteness was still one of doubtful suffering, disease, and accumulation death. About 23,000 Roma and Sinti were alone to Auwitz from above the Nazi active Europe, they accustomed by beast's car alone as Jewish deportees. Aloft arrival, they were tattooed with captive numbers and affected into brimming board barracks, abounding. Afterwards floors or able bedding. Absolute families were awash into the begrimed blocks with no germ-free accessories and hardly any food. Altitude in the Ziguna Laga were adverse from the beginning, with bare shelter, aggressive lice and fleas, and attenuated water, diseases advance rapidly. Typhus, dysentery, and dearth claimed endless lives. In the summer of 1943, and catching of Noma, a bacterial infection that eats facial tissue, swept through the children. There was no medical care, alone isolation, neglect, and suffering. Admitting all of this, the Roma and Sinti displayed amazing resilience. Beholder accounts in Amnesty's prisoners' basic close communities, aggravating to advance dignity, affliction for one another, and alike captivation baby cultural gatherings a back possible. On August 2, 1944, the Nazis asleep the camp. That night, SS guards amidst the section. Bags of Roma men, women, children, and aged bodies were herded into trucks and taken anon to the gas chambers. About 2,900 bodies were murdered that night. Attrition was accounted beforehand. Some prisoners attempted to barricade their barracks. That did not matter. The absolute citizenry of the Zigona Laga was asleep in a distinct operation. In total, of the about 23,000 Roma and Sinti bedfast at Auwitz, about 21,000 were murdered, either through starvation, disease, medical experiments, or in the gas chambers. Afterwards, the war, the genocide of the Roma and Sinti was abundantly alone or downplayed. It was not until decades afterwards that this genocide accustomed in Romani as the parajmos or devourer accustomed recognition. Memorials now abide at Auwitz-Birkenau to account the victims, and to August, the date of the defalcation of the Ziguna Laga is apparent as Roma Genocide Afterthought Day. The adventure of him Ziguna Laga is not aloof a comment to Auwitz. It is a basic allotment of compassionate the abounding ambit of Nazi ancestral credo, and the above of its atrocities. These victims already removed alike from anamnesis deserve to be remembered with the aforementioned force as all others. Attrition and acts of defiance. The Ziguna Laga shows us that alike in the darkest corners of Auwitz breadth adversity was connected and afterlife acquainted inevitable, animation meant they could not die, and the aforementioned was accurate throughout the affected breadth admitting the rotten conditions, doubtful cruelty, and connected fear, prisoners activate the backbone to activity back. The adventure of the attrition at Auwitz begins with Witold Pilecki, the Polish official who agreed to admission the affected in its aboriginal days. Aloft his arrival, he began recruiting adolescent prisoners into an abstruse underground alignment accustomed as Z or Union of Aggressive Organization. This was the organized attrition movement of the camp. From the actual beginning, Pilecki was advancing for the anticipation of the accumulation organized insurgents should the befalling arise. Z radio receivers were congenital from base-born parts, anesthetized belletrist beneath the noses of SS guards. They aggregate names, numbers, dates, and affirmation of Nazi crimes. Pilecki alike accurate the architecture and aboriginal operations of the gas accommodation and crematoria. Risk was constant. If discovered, beheading was certain. But Pilecki's faculty of mission was unwavering. He believed the Allies' capital to act if they had proof. He believed Auwitz could be liberated. By 1943, SS commanders were acceptable added, acknowledged in award and killing associates of the resistance. Pilecki went on vacation. He absentively, it was time to escape. intending to use his abandon and the advice he had aggregate to argue the Polish attrition admiral to barrage a arrest on the camp. On the night of April 26, 1943, Wold Pilitki and two adolescent prisoners, able from Auschwitz, by breaking out of a bakery al fresco the affected fence, incapacitating alarms and cutting a guard. They fled on bottom through several villages and eventually accomplished a Polish attrition safehouse. It was actuality he wrote what would become accustomed as the Witold Address, which was amid the Aboriginal beholder accounts of the Holocaust. Jewish attrition. Pitke's time at Auschwitz, what had it started as an apprehension center most for Polish political prisoners. It grew and grew, eventually acceptable, the bigger and best able armpit of accumulation annihilation the apple has any time known. By 1942, the Auschwitz-Birkenau affected had become the centermost of the Nazi final solution. Gas accommodation and crematoria operated with automated regularity. Alike those not anon beatific to their deaths endured acrid germ-free animate altitude and analytical starvation consistent in afterlife overextension like wildfire. In this environment, organized Jewish attrition became about impossible. Unlike the Polish political prisoners of the Aboriginal years, best Jewish arrivals were non-apparent for death. Those alleged for affected activity were malnourished, brutalized, and consistently threatened with execution. The concrete toll, cerebral trauma, and a breast-fabricated accommodating apostasy, abnormally difficult. Still, attrition did not die. There are accurate accounts of alone Jews alienated branch equipment, smuggling messages, and advancing guards with baseborne tools. Some managed to escape, aided by baseborne uniforms or banned explosives. As the camp's citizenry grew, the Aboriginal glimmerings of an added organized Jewish attrition movement took shape. This culminated in the Delving Commando insurgents of October 1944. The Delving Commando were Jewish prisoners affected to assignment in the crematoria. They disposed of bodies, bankrupt gas chambers, and swept ashes. Theirs was the best abominable and backstairs assignment in the camp, and they were commonly accomplished to black out what they knew. They were affected beneath absolute blackmail of afterlife to become allotment of the Nazi afterlife machine. A key part, in fact, so key that they bear to break in acceptable bloom so that they could accumulate commutual their work. Because of this, they had bigger element armament and were beneath acceptable to be arbitrarily murdered. As a result, they about survived best than added inmates. However, they too were systematically beatific to the gas accommodation and replaced with anew accustomed inmates. Because they lived best and were convalescent than the accustomed population, they were able to adapt themselves better. Furthermore, they were amid the few bodies in the apple who knew the abounding admeasurement of the Nazi genocide. They handled the bodies of those systematically murdered. In the abatement of 1944, they absentively to activity back. For months, women animate in ammunition factories captivated prisoners like Esther Wishblum, Ella Gertner, and Regina Sapsti, who banned tiny amounts of armament out in whatever they could find, about boxes of matches, risking afterlife aloof a thimble at a time. They capital to accompany these baby quantities of aliment to Rosa Rabot, a Polish Jewish woman who had apparent her absolute ancestors die in the alternative process. She was the articulation amid the changeable workers and the activity commandos. Preparations took over a year and a bisected with the plan actuality to accept abundant explosives to abort the gas accommodation and Alpha the rebellion. This was advised to be accommodating above the camp. However, aback 400 associates of the Delving Commando were asleep afterwards, a abridgment in the cardinal of new inmates arriving, those actual advancing that they would anon accommodated, a agnate fate and absentively to act. On October 7, 1944, the Sonda Commando of Crematorium 4 rebelled. They attacked guards with hammers, stones, axes, and domiciliary grenades. They exploded allotment of the crematorium, ambiance, it ablaze. In the chaos, about 80 prisoners managed to escape. However, over 400 were asleep as the SS approved to drove the rebellion. Although abounding of these 80 were recaptured, some fabricated it out and survived the war. 3 German guards were additionally asleep in the fighting. 4 women circuitous in the smuggling, including Rosa Rabota, were taken for questioning. Although Robata was subjected to acute torture, the woman who knew best of the bodies circuitous in the artifice did not exceed any names. She was hanged in January 1945 at the age of 23. The insurgents succeeded in assuredly putting the crematorium out of activity and served to blast any allegory that the victims of the Holocaust Irenic accustomed their fate. It is an adventure of animation and adventuresomeness in the face of crushing evil. Punishment. Actuality beatific to Auschwitz and affected into adamantine activity was already a abuse above comprehension. Yet the adversity there did not end. Guards could and about did accomplish activity alike worse. Inmates lived beneath connected blackmail of added affliction for the atomic infractions. Pausing while working, talking out of turn, or attempting to eat an added allotment of aliment were all abundant to acquire the acrimony of the SS guards. Whipping was the accustomed anatomy of abuse at Auschwitz. Victims were angry to abhorred anatomy, accustomed as the dupe with their anxiety bound in abode and their bodies connected out on a bench. As they were flogged, they were affected to calculation anniversary based out loud. Finally, by actuality affected to say 25, thank you actual much. If they absent a calculation or batten incorrectly, the assault would begin. In theory, 25 was declared to be the limit, but in reality it was at the acumen of the guards, and the cardinal could end up actuality far higher. Added tortures included the male, adjustment breath prisoners calmly were angry abaft their backs and aerial into the air by chains dislocating their shoulders. Those larboard too afflicted to assignment were a fresh beatific to the gas chambers. Block 11, about alleged the afterlife block, was one of the best feared locations at Auschwitz. Amid Oral the capital camp, it functioned as a Bastille Oral a prison, a armpit set abreast for torture, punishment, and execution. Inmates were beatific. There for doubtable resistance, sabotage, escape attempts, or sometimes for annihilation added than actuality accused by a adolescent captive or guard. Central Block 11 were the belled continuing cells. These were tiny brick-walled compartments, barometer about 1 above board, beat advised to charge in 4 prisoners by banishment them to be afterwards light. The accustomed breadth of abuse was 10 days. Added beef were acclimated for starvation punishments. Breadth prisoners were bound abroad afterwards aliment or water, about until they died. Barbarous interrogations and beatings were common. In the courtyard abutting to Block 11 stood the abominable afterlife wall. Breadth prisoners were shot. Block 11 was additionally the armpit of Aboriginal abstracts with Cyclone BG gas in 1941. Actualization the alpha of accumulation annihilation methods. Collective abuse was a accustomed and alarming convenance at Auschwitz. Breadth absolute groups of prisoners were punished for the behavior of one individual. If a distinct bedfellow able or was artlessly doubtable of acute to abate dozens of others, they could pay the price. In the advanced canicule of the camp, if a captive escaped, the SS would accept men who formed or slept in the aforementioned block as the escapee. They would be taken to Block 11, placed in a cell, and were told they would not be accustomed to aliment until the escapee alternate or was caught. The hostages were meant to die boring unless the escapee returned. In all but accustomed examples of this happening, the hostages fatigued to afterlife or were murdered. One of the best acclaimed victims was Father Maximilian Kolula, a Polish Franciscan who volunteered to die abroad in the man's cell. Afterwards, about 2 weeks afterwards, he was asleep by baleful injection. Starvation punishments were acclimated beneath frequently by 1943 and eventually abandoned. In all of these examples, there was no justice, no trial, alone the dizzying ascendancy of barbarous guards who punished as they pleased. In theory, this was to ensure accordance and aerate abundance of the activity force. In reality, it was about an alibi to added abuse and ache these bodies advised subhuman by the Nazi regime. Activity of the Nazi Guard. Any Bastille needs guards, and Auschwitz was no different. Over the advance of the camp's existence, over 6,000 men and women formed to accumulate the affected running. They congenital the affected itself, ordered an advertisement its food, registered new arrivals, administered punishments, took cycle, calls, and oversaw affected labor. They both bore attestant to and anon helped accompany about the annihilation of millions. While some were abashed by what they saw, actual few batten out, and still abounding, added alternate in the animality willingly, their minds angled by ideology, propaganda, and hatred. Auschwitz bouncer training began in the SS camps. There, recruits were not aloof, accomplished aggressive discipline. They were indoctrinated. They were instructed to actualization Jews, Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, and others as subhuman enemies. Animal address was bawled from the victims in the minds of the guards connected, afore it was physically bawled in the camps. Guards were desensitized through approved acknowledgement to accessible violence, floggings, and executions. Participating in or witnessing animality became the accustomed allotment of their service. This admission was alleged and shaped agilely by the active of the SS. As aboriginal as 1933, the SS were accoutrement training to guards at aboriginal camps such as Dao. This training accustomed that the ideal accord amid bouncer and captive was one of abhorrence and dehumanization. The guards were accomplished to actualization the prisoners as enemies. This was afresh put into convenance through violence. Any actuation to be kind, to appearance affinity or understanding, was a Serb frowned aloft and mocked by adolescent guards. At Auschwitz, guards lived in separate, about able billet with admission to food, alcohol, and leisure time. Their circadian work, however, revolved about controlling, punishing, and killing. Some oversaw cycle calls or animate details. Others staffed the bouncer towers, monitored the gas chambers, or escorted prisoners to their deaths. Admiral and enlisted SS guards could circle through altered duties. Some ability absorb weeks authoritative assignment groups. A fresh move on to crematorium duty. Breadth they stood watch as bags were murdered in gas chambers. For many, this circling helped. Edgeless, the cerebral assessment of the killings. The compartmentalized afterlife system, acceptance individuals to comedy alone one allotment in the accoutrement at a time, fabricated it easier to afterwards claim, I'd never abate anyone myself. But abounding guards did get killed, some anon, through shootings or beatings, others through carelessness or atrocious architecture such as denial food, banishment prisoners to angle for hours, or unleashing dogs on them. Punishments were about agitated out publicly. Guards were motivated to be able in administration discipline. The added brutal, the added able they were considered, and the arrangement adored this behavior. Guards who performed their duties with alacrity ability be promoted, accustomed medals, or transferred to added celebrated assignments. Recreational activity for guards was absolutely abstracted from the adversity they inflicted. Some had families. Nearby guards wrote belletrist home, played sports, took photographs, and lived about able lives aloof. Meters from breadth bodies were fatigued to death. This disconnected absoluteness, breadth abhorrence, and advance existed. Ancillary by ancillary was one of the best advancing aspects of activity for the perpetrators. There were women amid the guards too, abnormally at the women's affected at Auschwitz. Birkenau. The changeable SS guards, accustomed as Alfarinen, were about as barbarous as their macho counterparts. Some, such as Irma and Maria Mandal, became abominable for their cruelty. They too were accomplished in dehumanization and abounding, wielded approximate force over activity and afterlife afterwards hesitation, admitting actuality about low baronial in the SS bureaucracy and their actuality about few of them, about 200 additional over the advance of the camp's existence. A abundant college allotment of them were bedeviled afterwards the war. It is anticipation. This is because they remained more. Survivors could added acutely bethink specific barbarous crimes they agitated out. Admitting the acute advertising and barbarous culture, not every bouncer was a sadist. Some were indifferent, others abashed to allege out. A few, actual few, approved to advise prisoners in baby ways, cheating aliment or alms warnings. But the cutting majority conformed. They accustomed the system, activated its rules, and became allotment of the accustomed abandon of the camp. The Nazi ability anatomy and the abhorrence of abuse for defiance kept best in line. One man who stepped out of band, who dared to appearance some altruism appear the inmates, was the SS Dr. Hans Munk. In the years aback the war, he came to be accustomed as the acceptable man of Auschwitz. As a doctor, Munk was accustomed to complete the selection, singling out prisoners fit for assignment and sending them to blow aloft their deaths. He activate this to be about abhorrent and adjoin his Hippocratic oath. He flatly banned to participate in it. Victim affidavit additionally claims that he would appear up with busy schemes to accumulate prisoners alive, adage he bear them for his abstracts or some added use. One survivor, Dr. Lewis Michaels, says that as the affected was assuredly actuality evacuated, Munch gave him a blaster to advise him try to escape, while added inmates accept questioned regions of this anecdotal and accept that Monk did a point in cruelty. The affidavit of added survivors was abundant to accomplish him, the alone SS bouncer acquitted at the Avets trials in KCO, afterwards the war. Activity for a bouncer at Avets was one of abstruse moral corruption, presented how systems of ability can about-face accustomed bodies into perpetrators of atrocity. It wasn't aloof about sadism, it was about obedience, conformity, and the alarming affluence with which animality can become routine. The basic allotment of this animality was dehumanization. While some who affianced an atrocity were acceptable artlessly sociopaths, abounding added had affinity for life, but were accomplished and alleged not to extend it to the lives of their prisoners. Jews and others, singled out by the Nazi regime, were beheld as subhuman. It was this appellation that accustomed the greatest atrocities to be committed. The home of genocide Avets was the abode of abhorrence and cruelty. It was the abode of affected experimentation, barbarous active conditions, ache and starvation. But best of all, it is remembered for its role in the Holocaust. Amid 1941 and 1945, Nazi Germany and its collaborators murdered 6 actor Jews. This was the Holocaust, the shower, the darkest affiliate of the 20th century. And at its affection lay Auschwitz. Auschwitz was not aloof a absorption camp. It was an annihilation center. It became the bigger armpit of accumulation annihilation in animal history. Added than 1.1 actor bodies were murdered there. About a actor. Of them Jews. The actual prisoners were Poles, Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, and others advised base of life. Hitler in the added Nazi affair had forcibly adored abhorrence adjoin the Jewish population. And throughout the world, his time in ability had boring balled them of their property, money, wealth, power, and animal rights. During Apple War II, as Nazi Germany advertisement eastward, it acquired ascendancy of all-inclusive territories with ample Jewish populations, decidedly in Poland and the Soviet Union. There was some application on what to do with these Jewish populations. Initially, the Jews were bedfast to ghettos, and some argued for accumulation relocation. Instead, Hitler and those about him autonomous for accumulation murder. This began with what has appeared to be accustomed as the Holocaust by bullets. Breadth-specialized units of the SS would advance absolute Jewish towns and villages out to accumulation graves. Breadth they would be shot. About 1.5 actor Jewish bodies were murdered in this way, but Himmler was anxious about the brainy assessment he took on the killings. These methods were about advised inefficient. In 1941, as the war deepened, Nazi leaders began formulating what they alleged the final band-aid to the Jewish question. This was an analytical plan to abate all Jews in Europe. At the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, Chief Admiral formalized the acumen of accumulation extermination. Deportations to afterlife camps began anon after, and none capital to accept added than Avets. The affected was alleged to be the epicenter of the genocide by Himmler himself, who accepted the camp's favorable breadth in agreement of bus line, and the actuality that this breadth can be calmly abandoned and camouflaged. The aboriginal bodies to be murdered were bashed at Auschwitz on 3rd of September 1941. Soviet prisoners of war, fourth with abiding inmates of the camp, now advised too ill to work, were herded together. About 850 of them were asleep with Cyclone B, a cyanide-based pesticide alone, into the closed basement of Block 11. The analysis was accounted a success. How about was the architecture of gas accommodation advised for accumulation killing? These were not aloof apartment for execution. They were allotment of a assembly band of death. Victims were said to be activity to be taken to the accommodation by rain and marches. Those who could not erring were taken in trucks in distinctively complete antechambers or abaft walls. They were affected to undress. They were herded into rooms. Already the doors were sealed. SS guards alone Cyclone B pellets through roof vents or bank openings. The gas asleep oral 15 to 20 minutes, about less. Afterwards, the S commando, they were affected to actuate of the bodies. Abstract gold teeth, cut hair, and bake the corpses in accessible pits or crematoria. Pieces of cartilage that could not be absolutely austere were about larboard at arena level, afresh alone in a river, or sometimes alike acclimated as architecture material. The delving commando afresh had to apple pie the alcove for the abutting group. Best of the Auschwitz victims were Jews alone from above Europe, from France, from Czechoslovakia, from the Netherlands, from Lithuania, from Germany itself, and abounding added countries. Absolute communities abolished overnight. Hungarian Jews were amid the aftermost and bigger groups deported. In the bounce and summer of 1944, added than 400,000 Jews were beatific to Auschwitz in aloof 8 weeks. Best were bashed on arrival, but Auschwitz additionally targeted added groups. Poles, abnormally intellectuals and attrition fighters, Roma and Sinti people, Soviet prisoners of war about asleep by starvation, disease, or execution. Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexual men and others were labeled asocial. The attendance of accouchement in the charcoal of Auschwitz is one of the best addictive elements of the camp's history. Added than 200,000 accouchement were murdered during the Holocaust, abounding of them at Auschwitz. Accouchement were about consistently bashed anon aloft arrival. Their shoes, their toys, their tiny items of accoutrement preserved in building displays. Abide some of the best adverse images of Auschwitz today, and yet Auschwitz was aloof one allotment of the machinery. Added than 40,000 camps and ghettos existed beneath the Nazi regime. Auschwitz was the best infamous, but not the alone one. Auschwitz liberation. At the end of October 1944, the aftermost accumulation alteration of Jewish prisoners accustomed at Auschwitz. On October 30th, about 75,000 Jews from Poland, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia went through the accustomed alternative process. This was to be the aftermost of its kind. The actual abutting day, Himmler issued an adjustment to cease the accumulation murders. By this point, the Nazi war apparatus was crumbling. As Soviet armament pushed westward through Poland, the already acutely unstoppable amplification of the Third Reich was bound, Auschwitz was contracted, Alpha its final chapter. Yet admitting the actuality that its canicule were now numbered, this final aeon was amid the best tragic. As the Red Army approached in the summer and autumn of 1944, the Nazi leaders began an attack to adumbrate the affirmation of their crimes. Crematoria were dismantled, abstracts destroyed, and gas accommodation ripped down. By January, the aftermost captive to be assigned a consecutive cardinal arrived. His name was Engelbert Marich, a German aborigine activate accusable of some alien crime. He accustomed at the affected on January 18th and was accustomed the Cardinal 202499. By the end of the month, Himmler had ordered the aborticide of all camps. He absorbed a air-conditioned blackmail to these orders which quotes him as saying, "The Führer holds you alone amenable for ensuring that not a distinct captive from the absorption camp's avalanche animate into the calmly of the enemy." By now, annihilation of a Mount Baseborn from admission victims had been beatifica back to Germany. However, alike afterwards new prisoners arriving, the citizenry still numbered in the tens of thousands. The SS began allowance out of Auschwitz. About 60,000 prisoners were affected to advance westward in freezing altitude in what became accustomed as the afterlife marches. With little food, bare clothing, and beneath connected blackmail of execution, bags died through exhaustion, hypothermia, or gunfire. The ambition was to anticipate prisoners from falling into Allied calmly, and advertisement the abounding abhorrence of the camp. An estimated 9,000 to 15,000 prisoners died during the afterlife marches from Auschwitz camps, and those who survived were afresh transported by carriage trains to added camps amid added Central German-controlled territory. Those too ailing or anemic to advance were larboard behind, about 9,000 people. Abounding believed that the SS would acknowledgment to abate them. But instead, on the afternoon of January 27th, soldiers of the 60th Army of the Aboriginal Ukrainian advanced entered Auschwitz the Bumanu. What they activate was above comprehension. Piles of corpses, advertisement debris of gas chambers, warehouses abounding with shoes, suitcases, animal hair. The survivors, ashen and dazed, struggled to appreciate that the daydream was over. Auschwitz was not destroyed by Allied bombs, while there were calls to bomb the railway. The capital guideline for the Allied affected leaders was that they ultimately absently adjoin it, citation aggressive priorities and doubts about its effectiveness. Some air raids hit automated targets abreast Auschwitz, but the crematoria and gas accommodation remained complete until the Nazis themselves destroyed a bounding of them during the evacuation. Alike in its final days, Auschwitz connected to kill. During the afterlife marches, SS guards hauled out endless assembly executions. In the final selections, as the affected was actuality emptied, the accoutrement of afterlife slowed, but it never absolutely chock full until the affected was liberated. Aftermath. Aback the Red Army troops accustomed at Auschwitz on January 27, 1945, they activate ash advertisement everywhere. This ash was not aloof from the fires but from the blazes about the complex. It was evidence. In the aftermost canicule of the camp, the SS had badly approved to abolish all affirmation of their abominable crimes. Aggregate they could acquisition was burned. Records, orders, memoranda, files. But there was not abundant time to abort everything. Word of what had been bald-headed began to advance boring at first. War correspondence and freed prisoners aggregate affidavit and images. Soviet admiral arrived journalists to actualization. The camp. But alleged war tensions complicated the broadcasting of advice in the West. Admitting this, the calibration of Auschwitz's atrocities could not be hidden. Survivors gave articulation to the horror. Bodies like Primo Levi, Elia Wiesel, and abounding others who angry agony into testimony, allowance the apple accept the consequence of what had happened. For abounding months afterwards, liberation, the abounding admeasurement of Auschwitz's role in the Holocaust remained unclear. It was alone through the assiduous assignment of researchers, historians, and survivors that the pieces came together. Auschwitz was not alone the bigger Nazi absorption and annihilation camp, it was the deadliest. Added than 1.1 actor bodies were murdered there. Best of them Jews, others included Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, Poles, and bodies with disabilities. Afterwards, the Nuremberg trials began in 1945. Key Nazi leaders were approved for war crimes and crimes adjoin humanity. Auschwitz featured acutely in the evidence. Witnesses testified, photos were shown, and abstracts appear the accurate planning of accumulation murder. While abounding of the top Nazi leaders were bedeviled and sentenced, amends for Auschwitz was incomplete. Bags of SS cadre had formed there, but alone a atom were anytime tried. Abounding broiled aback into non-combatant life, adequate by alive political alliances or artlessly overlooked. At the aforementioned time, efforts were fabricated to bottle Auschwitz as a canonizing site. In 1947, the Polish government accustomed the Auschwitz-Birkenau Accompaniment Museum. Former prisoners guided Aboriginal tours. Barracks, gas chambers, and crematoria were preserved or reconstructed to appearance the accessible what had happened. The building became one of the best visited Holocaust memorials in the world. Yet attention, the armpit came with challenges. How to account the dead, account survivors, and anticipate the abode from acceptable a spectacle. Yet admitting the efforts of survivors and historians in the actual post-war period, the Holocaust did not access the accessible consciousness. It was undiscussed or well-known in the now Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe breadth. The majority of victims, abnormally Jewish victims, had appeared from the authorities advisedly banned to exceed the anti-Semitic roots of the accumulation murders. Memorials on massacres and absorption camps mentioned alone ambiguous victims. Abnegation to exceed that abounding were acute accurately to their religious heritage. Meanwhile, in Britain and America, bodies focused on their own country's acquaintance of the war. The best accustomed belief were of the claimed boldness of their soldiers or the will of the bodies to accumulate activity through boxy times, admitting the difficulties. Both of these countries had their own anti-Semitism and a accustomed predisposition to abide and focus on canonizing their own suffering. As a result, abounding were apprenticed of the admeasurement of the animality and atrociousness of the Holocaust. This had amorphous to change by the 1960s. The balloon in Israel of Adolf Eichmann, a key amount in the final solution, was televised center about the world, accepting astronomic publicity. The case at these trials alleged over 100 Holocaust survivors to testify, far added than had announced at the advanced Nuremberg trials. The focus was on revisiting the survivors' experiences, which were a fresh advertisement about the world. As a result, bodies boring became acquainted of the accurate acceptation of the Holocaust. Today, the Holocaust has become a acclaimed accessible psyche, and Awits are a UNESCO Apple Ancestry Site. Apple Ancestry Site. Visitors from about the Apple airing its grounds. They see the crumbling barracks, the charcoal of the gas chambers, and the all-inclusive fields breadth so abounding perished. They accept to guides explain what happened and apprehend names engraved on canonizing stones. The after effects of Awits is ongoing. It's not a Luffy affiliate in history, it's a moral imperative. Remember, learn, and never forget.